Hi everyone, my name is Dr Gilly Carr and I am the Academic Director in Archaeology at the Institute of Continuing Education. And I'm going to be talking to you about how to develop an archaeologist's eye. And I'm going to start with a box of artefacts that was given to me by one of my predecessors in my job, Dr David Trump. And the box contains objects that were excavated in the early 1990s at Madingley Hall, which is the home of the Institute of Continuing Education. And I often use these objects with new students to get them thinking about archaeological artefacts and to give them a chance to handle them. Now, one of the largest objects in this box is an ox bone. And when archaeologists find bones of animals, one of the first things we look for, once we've worked out what animal it might be, is we look for butchery marks, because when you dismember a carcass to cut it into meat joints, you can see the marks left behind, some of the knife marks, some of the butchery marks still on these bones. So we can see in the image on the right here that there is a cut mark at the edge of the bone, and you can see where the bone has split. It's not a clean cut at all, but it begins to help us think about diet of the people who lived in this area. There's also a lot of pottery in this box, and some of the pottery is very fine and beautiful and high status, and some of it is very thick and chunky and not at all fine in its fabric. And so when we look at pottery, there are a number of things that we as archaeologists think about. We think about status, and where we have very beautiful, fine, easily broken pottery on the whole, that tends to be pottery that was used perhaps on the table as tableware, as part of, showing off your beautiful ceramics that you eat and drink out of. But the more chunky, rougher stuff tends to be used, it tends to have a more kind of functional kitchen or storage function to it. And one of the other things that we look at in terms of status and in terms of age is we look at the glaze on pottery. And this helps us age a pot. And so, for example, if we wanted to know how old a pot was, a bit of ceramic, what we would do is perhaps, if we were an expert in, let us say, medieval pottery, we might recognize straight away from the design on that glaze how old the pot was, because we would be used to finding objects of that date. But one of the ways in which, if you're just starting out in archaeology, you can become familiar with aging a pot from the little piece that you found from the glaze. You would perhaps try and match it with other examples, perhaps that were on display in a museum, or you might get a book on medieval pottery and come to be familiar with a type of pot from its glaze, from its design, from its thickness, from its cross-section. There are lots of different things that you can look at. But in terms of status, you have to think about who was using that pottery. And so at Madingley Hall, for example, we find both beautiful, thin, fine painted pottery, which would be much more high status compared to the chunky storage vessels, which are deemed to be lower status, or perhaps used by people who couldn't afford the beautiful, fine pottery. So one of the things that we do when we have our multiple pieces of pottery is, one of the questions we ask of it is, how many different vessels do we have represented here? Now, of course, this can be quite a difficult question. We can't assume that every single bit of pottery comes from a different vessel. Of course, you would compare the glaze on the different pieces to see whether they're very similar, but also you'd look at the cross-section, you'd look at the thickness of the pottery. So let's say you had two bits where the glaze was very similar and it looked to you like that probably came from the same vessel. If you look at the cross-section of it, the thickness of the pot, you would, if those two pieces were identical thickness, again, that's another clue that it might come from the same vessel. But if they're vastly different thickness, that indicates they're from two different vessels. Another thing that we as archaeologists do with bits of ceramic that we find is it can be hard to tell from just a little bit of the base or the rim fragment of a pot precisely how big it was. It can be hard to visualize that, and so we have these scales that we can place pots on to sort of build up an idea of how big the circumference was. So you can see from this image that you would get your bit of pot and you would move it up and down the scale until the curvature of the pot would fit on the chart, so you get an idea of what the circumference was. And that's important because if the circumference is very narrow, then you kind of probably get an idea that it might have been a liquid in the pot. But if it was a very wide circumference, then it indicates that you might have had food rather than liquid, something sort of more solid. So it starts to give you an indication of what that vessel might have held. And as well, by looking at the size of the vessel, you can get an idea of whether it was containing food for many people, if it was a communal vessel, or whether it was quite a small bowl that might have been for a single person. So there are lots of different questions we can begin to ask of objects. The sorts of objects that we're looking at here are all 19th century, and they all have rather fine designs on them, and they're very thin, and these all suggest to us that these are high status objects. And so we know at Madingley Hall, of course, you've got the hall itself and the people who would have lived within this stately home. And there were also some houses which were near the hall, but the people who lived in the hall were not the people who lived in the other houses within the grounds of the hall. And so when we see the sort of fine china, fine fabrics represented here, we can begin to make some suggestions about who was using it. Was it the rich people who lived in the hall, or the poorer people who lived elsewhere in the village, but within the wider grounds of Madingley Hall? And you can see that within this image, there's, as well as pottery, there's also a nice little button. Now, when I inherited this box of objects, there were bags containing objects from different periods, and there is also an archaeological report about the things that were found in Madingley Hall, but I got those on a separate occasion, and so sometimes it's not always easy to sort of match together the two. So the next item that I want to show you is this rather curiously shaped piece of glass. It's a torpedo-shaped soda water bottle, and it was deliberately designed with this kind of torpedo shape on the base. This was not a bottle of water that was designed to stand upright. It was designed to lie down on its side, and it would have had to lie down because it would have had a cork in the end which would have been wired down, and the cork had to stay wet. If it dried out, then it would shrink, and the liquid, the water within the bottle, would lose its carbonation. So the thick glass as well of this bottle, it also tells us that it was carbonated water inside, because the glass had to be thick to withstand the pressures of carbonation. So both the thickness of the glass and the shape of the bottle tell us about the contents, and this dated to the early 20th century. But also the box contains a rather large base of a bottle. It wasn't just a standard wine bottle size. It was quite large, as you can see from this image of it sitting in my hand. And this tells me that it was probably perhaps a champagne bottle, and even if it was wine, it probably would have been fairly high status. So once again, we're getting an indication about who would have been drinking this. Would it have been the people in the hall, or the people who were not as high status living within the grounds? And there were also some objects from the topsoil. Now, objects from the topsoil are things which are not located within the stratigraphic layers of the soil. And so when you excavate as an archaeologist, before you start to get into the stratigraphy, there might be the things that are just beneath the grass. And so it's hard to date them from their stratigraphic layer, because they've somehow been churned up by the action of worms or rabbits or whatever. And so you'll get a mixture of things from multiple different dates all mixed in together. So the way that we would date these is we would use typology. We would match the object from the design on the glaze, and we would match it with objects in museums or in books of pottery of that period. So that's how dating is done for items that are in the topsoil. And you can see there's a lovely mixture here of some very fine pottery, some older, more chunky pottery. There's a handle, and there's a little clay pipe. Now, I absolutely love clay pipes. I think they're rather fabulous because I don't know if you've ever seen clay pipes before, but originally they had very long stems like this. The stem could be, I don't know, 30 centimeters or longer. And you can date these clay pipes by looking at the size of the bowl and the size of the hole. Now, when tobacco first began to be smoked, of course, it was very expensive, and so the bowl of the pipe was very small because you would only be burning a little bit of it at a time, and there would be a very tiny hole in the pipe, in the stem, so that you would sort of more slowly get through that tobacco. But then as time went on and tobacco became much cheaper and more plentiful, the size of the bowls got larger and the size of the hole in the stem got wider, so people would be kind of burning through it and it wouldn't matter because it was cheap and plentiful. And so when you find a small bowl or a very fine small hole in your stem, you've got an older example of a clay pipe. And they're really quite ubiquitous in the archaeological record, but I have a soft spot for them. I think they're very interesting, very nice objects. So let's summarize here. What kind of things the archaeologists look at with an archaeologist's eye? Well, we think about the age of an object, and we tell that from its style, from its type. We think about the function of the object, what it was used for. We think about the status of the object, who used it, and how much of the object do you have present? Do we have just a tiny little bit? Do we have quite a lot? How many different objects do we have represented? But we're also really interested in context, and we ask, where an object is found tell us about it? Because after all, is it in the rubbish dump of the people who lived in the fine house or the rubbish dump of the people who did not? Is it found within a grave? Is it found, so context can be really important when it comes to interpretation.